linguistic or religious. And I think in any transition, and I think if Iran did make a transition, it would need to look fundamentally at its laws of the game, its rules of the game. You would need to open up the floor to many different voices. So the election system matters because the votes translated into seats are going to vary dramatically under different types of democratic systems. As Yasmin notes, the majoritarian nature of the Iranian system acts very differently to how potentially a proportional system or a hybrid system might work in Iran. The election system in Iran helps determine the legitimacy of the outcome, whether people feel the election results were fair and cognizant of the way that they voted. The system also, not just in Iran, but almost any other case, provides incentives for reconciliation or bridge building between polarized groups, or it can actually entrench and exaggerate those polarizations between groups. The system provides a spin to the campaign. It provides a tone to politics that allows parties to either reach out or be very insular and somewhat hostile to other groups. We also know that the system will allow the voters to hold their government and the individual MPs accountable or not. Can you throw out that failing member of parliament on the ground? Can you remove a government or a governing party if it ceases to really articulate the needs of the people? The system determines the ease or the threshold that you need in change of votes to throw people out or throw governments out. And finally, the system itself is clearly going to think about the way in which governments are formed and how stable and effective they can be. You know, we've seen very divided and fragile societies take months and months and months to form new governments because of their systems. And of course, I refer to Belgium. Even Iraq as well took a long time to bring together a cabinet because of the election system. Is that a good thing? Some people say in Iraq it's not necessarily the need to rush to a majoritarian government. Actually, the horse trading that goes on behind the scenes was a necessary evil in a place like Iraq, as it is in Belgium today. When it comes to election administration, which Yasmin also touches upon and is a particular area of expertise at IFES, it's clear to me that one of the chief areas of focus in Iran is the administration and the quality of the elections. You cannot have legitimate elections with deeply flawed electoral administrators. When the elections seem to be rigged, they are rigged by people who have a partisan interest in the outcome. And unless the administration is, in all its manifestations, neutral, apoliticized, nonpartisan, and funded in a way that allows it not to be bought by political actors, it's very difficult to move forward. So in conclusion, I had jotted down, after reading the report, a couple of positives and a couple of negatives about the Iranian election system, because I do think, as Yasmin said, there are elements to be built on here. There's a history, there's a precedence, there is a weight of experience that Iran has, unlike many of its neighboring countries, in the electoral political sphere. One of the positive areas is that it has a recognition and a space for minority communities. Above and beyond the reserved seats for minority communities that have been there for almost a century now, you have a recognition that minorities should be involved within the political system, and that is not the case in every other democratizing nation state. You also have some historical competition that Yasmin lays out in this document, that there has been significant competition, even if that competition isn't always reflected in power at the end of the day. And as I said, there is a long legacy of electoral politics that has acted at times in a fairly competitive way, and other times that competition has been squashed even as the results were being put out. The three areas, I think, of chief deficit in the Iranian electoral framework are, to me, as a non-expert, overwhelmingly the issue of vetting, of approving candidates, is a hugely problematic area. I mean, the democratic principle allows anybody who is registered to vote to stand for office. There's obviously some question about age criteria, but at the end of the day, you cannot have a political mobilized committee choosing who is allowed to stand for office. So vetting, the Guardian Council, is one of the chief blocks to democratization in Iran. The administration, as I said, needs to be radically detached from the state. the electoral administration needs to be set up in such a way that people, the voters, winners and losers, feel some plausible faith that the rules of the game are fair and everyone is treated equally. And then finally, there is a question about the specific election system that Iran uses. Even if it's a non-democracy, it uses a francophone two-round system, somewhat idiosyncratic, but it has a majoritarian winner-take-all ethos in smaller villages and towns where they elect one or two people under a two-round system, a runoff system. And again, the question would be, if Iran moves to a more democratic polity, what type of system is best going to reflect all the different elements, the diversities within society? Maybe that system is not the most appropriate system to reflect all the different views and different opinions. It certainly gives an advantage to the pre-existing, stronger regime elements. And these debates are going on not just in Iran, but throughout the region and elsewhere, about how to balance the principles of representation and governance through rules that do a number of different things. And the difficulty is that nothing works in a perfect vacuum and is affected by the politics and the finance and the regional pressures that any nation state works within. But I close again in congratulating Yasmin, and I'd urge you all to read the document and use it in your work, because it really is a terrific example of how to describe and get a good way of getting into the understanding of politics in a democratizing or a pseudo-democratic state. Thank you.
Thank you very much to IFES for inviting me, and Yasmin, I also congratulate you. I thought I knew a lot about the Iranian system, but there were some things that I learned from your report, and it certainly sharpened my analysis of how Iranian politics work. We always used to say about Iran that the fraud takes place before the elections. The Guardian Council, as was mentioned, has this extraordinary role in terms of vetting candidates, so at the end of the day, you're left with just a couple of choices. What we saw in 2009 is that the fraud can also take place after the elections. The report does not go into 2009 in great detail, but there were a couple of aspects that I thought were interesting and that I hadn't been aware of before. You know, there's this great debate. There are some who say, oh, no, they were fair. Ahmadinejad really got 63% of the vote. Even though Ayatollah Khamenei came out just a few hours after the polls closed and declared him the victor, which is a violation of the system, which requires the Guardian Council, I believe, first to approve the results before the Supreme Leader can. But buried in these charts and tables, which I recommend to you, is the fact that in two provinces, Manzandaran and Yazd, both had 100% turnout of registered voters in the election. I don't know that there's ever been an election anywhere where 100% of those registered to vote turned out. Looking through the report, there were a number of aspects that I thought were problematic, and Andy talked about the rules of the game. The rules of the game are the problem in Iran. It's not just the vetting function of the Guardian Council, which makes it very difficult to affect change. There are other flaws in the system. They don't have a proper electoral roll that shows all the registered voters, which means it's very easy for dead people to vote. It's very easy for people to vote more than once, to stuff the ballot box, to use all those good tricks that Chicago perfected. People can vote anywhere. All they have to do is present an ID document, which, let's see if I can pronounce it right. How do you pronounce it?
Shenasname.
Shenasname. Okay. These, I assume, can be counterfeit. Very easy in terms of fraud. Campaigns. They're very, very short. For the Majlis, only 8 days. So just a little more than a week to run for parliament, which hardly gives people a chance to vet candidates, particularly if they're not well-known personalities. And for president, it's less than a month. So again, the system is tipped toward those who are well-known personalities, namely those that have been in power or close to power for years and years and years. The other thing I didn't know was the difficulty of staging a referendum. When Khatami was president, Parliament thought about having some sort of referendum on the issue of the Guardian Council and taking away its powers of vetting. But they weren't able to bring that about, and it's one of the reasons it's just very, very difficult to stage one of these referendums. It has to be approved by 2/3 of the members of the Majlis. And that was difficult even when Khatami was president. Another catch-22 in the system, according to Article 177 of the Constitution, only the leader, the supreme leader, can initiate proceedings to amend the Constitution. And why would the supreme leader do that when the Constitution gives him so many powers? And then there are various subjects which are not, which you cannot make the topic of a referendum, such as the Islamic character of the system. So why even bother when you can't even challenge that aspect of the system? Other things that are useful in the report, it talks about turnout, and turnout in presidential elections has varied between 50 and 85%. The pattern has been that when the turnout is very high, it's because people have come to vote the bums out. In 1997, there was a high turnout to elect Khatami, who was not supposed to win. It was supposed to be the former Speaker of the Parliament, Natik Nouri. Khatami was a surprise victor. This is another reason why I think it's very difficult to believe that Ahmadinejad really won more than 50% of the vote in 2009. Why would more people come out to vote in favor of the incumbent than had been historically the case in the past? I think Rafsanjani was re-elected with the lowest turnout, 50% in 1993. So it simply doesn't make sense that all of these people would come out to vote in favor of Ahmadinejad. His performance in office had not been that successful. When you look at the system in Iran and the various catch-22s in it, you go back to the issue of the supreme leader. And when Khatami was the president, there were a lot of hopes that he would be able to liberalize the system. Some people even called him Ayatollah Gorbachev. The Ayatollah Gorbachev has to be the supreme leader. At least the way the system is set up now, the supreme leader will always be able to check the actions of the president. Supreme leader controls so many of the other bodies. Basically, the supreme leader controls the Guardian Council because he names 6 members directly. The other 6 are named by the head of the judiciary, who is nominated, who is appointed by the supreme leader. So the supreme leader controls the Guardian Council. And until you have an Ayatollah Gorbachev, or you get rid of the job of supreme leader altogether somehow, which is difficult the way the system is set up, you're always going to have this body there vetting candidates, preventing people from truly participating. The miracle of the Iranian system is that people still somehow come out and vote. And we were having this discussion before the event. I would be very surprised to see turnouts above 50% in certainly the 2012 parliamentary election and the 2013 presidential election, because what have people learned from their experience now? They've learned that there's fraud before the vote and there's fraud after the vote. So the only reason to come out is because you need a stamp in your ID document saying you voted, which is important if you're a government worker, if you're connected to the bureaucracy in some way. So you'll always get 20–30% that will show up to get that stamp. But why on earth would anybody else turn out when, at least the way the system is set up now, the choices are so restricted? The only other possibility, of course, is that, I mean, this is another feature of Iranian politics, that whenever they try to close off dissent, even the small groups that are kosher and allowed to participate develop splits and they begin attacking each other. So we could have a lively debate between various conservative and neoconservative factions, with so-called traditional conservatives attacking the neoconservatives, which might create a little bit of buzz and a little bit of interest. Perhaps the authorities will relax things so that women can come out on the streets in bad hijab and hold signs and have parties. I mean, one of the reasons people participate is because it is a sort of party-like atmosphere. Particularly before a presidential election, you can get away with a lot of things in terms of public behavior if you're a young Iranian that you can't in normal times. So perhaps we'll see a little bit of that. But I still think that given the way things are now, the participation is going to be rather low. People are watching what's happening in the rest of the Middle East, and they're even more disgusted with the shortcomings in their own system as a result. If you're having a freely elected president in Egypt, a freely elected president in Tunisia, maybe even regime change in Libya and in Yemen, it's going to be very hard as an Iranian to justify coming out to vote for Tweedledee or Tweedledum. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you very much. We've got time for some questions, and unless someone has one right now, I'll take the prerogative of the chair. Recently, Rafsanjani was removed as the head of the Assembly of Experts. What does that say about the real future for reforms and for reformists in Iran, in the system, and just in general? That was, what, maybe 2 weeks ago? I guess
I'll take a stab at it, and then I'll pass it on to Barbara. I'll talk about reformists. I won't talk about the future of reform. I'll leave that for Barbara. I think the regime has paid a heavy cost for eliminating reformists back in the 2009 elections. A lot of the people I interviewed for the report said, who had been in jail back in early 2000, bloggers, intellectuals, said that their interrogators constantly told them that we have this project of eliminating the reformists. They would bring up the names of Tajzadeh, who's now in prison, Nabavi, and say, we're going after these people. These are all members of Khatami's cabinet. And a lot of them said to me that this has been well planned for 10 years. So I highly doubt that as we move forward to the 2012 parliamentary elections, we're going to see the regime bring out the reform card. That's not going to happen. I think this is the last purge of the reformists. And as Barbara pointed out, what we will see is some factional politics among the neoconservatives that are close to Ahmadinejad, the radical conservatives that are close to the leader, the pragmatic conservatives, as well as the traditional conservatives. We'll see some power politics among them. But I think the reformists are pretty much done at this point.
Yeah, I think that the move against Rafsanjani, he was removed as head of the Assembly of Experts, which is the body that's supposed to choose the next supreme leader. Some Rafsanjani supporters suggested that this was all part of a larger plan and that Rafsanjani himself decided to do this in order to step back for the bigger fight, but I don't think most people saw it that way. It's another example of the regime narrowing its base. It's going to force Rafsanjani more definitively into the opposition, and he still has some power, certainly financial power. His kids are largely out of the country where they're big supporters of the Green Movement, and they're doing their best to keep things bubbling from the outside. He could have been a mediating figure. He's done that traditionally. He's tried to mediate between left and right in the system. And now, basically he's been told, we don't need you anymore. So I think it's a troubling development, and it's one that may bite the regime in the butt if they're not careful.
Any questions? Sorry, in the far back, please. And what I'll do is I'll repeat the question just so that people who are listening to the webcast can understand. Okay, I'll turn it over to Andy. You're probably the best. Well, you mentioned the French model, so the general question was talking about how the system seemed to be modeled on Rousseau rather than a Madisonian model, and why don't we look at that more, and what are the implications?
I don't know the details of the evolution of the Iranian system to be able to comment specifically on that. But it seems to me that I'm sure, you know, the theoretical, the philosophical background that you're highlighting, I mean, is a strand that runs through political theory and political philosophy for, you know, thousands of years. And so I think it's reflected in this notion in modern times, and we may get hung up on the democracy definition, but it's reflected in this notion of collective good versus individual good. And one could see echoes in Southeast Asia, echoes in Singapore, echoes in Malaysia, of to what extent does the populace need to be protected from itself by a sort of some type of leviathan, some type of benevolent dictatorship that's either articulated in a theocratic sense or in some other sense, a military regime that has the interest, like the Tatmadaw in Burma, the interests of the nation at heart and protects the country from corrupt and illegitimate civilian politicians. So I think there are, I mean, obviously Iran is different, and it may well be there's a very direct bloodline from Rousseau through France to Iranian constructs. I don't know about those details, but certainly there are echoes in this idea about how you craft a nation to have its government to protect the greater good of the people. And obviously there are different conceptions about whether that's a collective good or based on individual human rights. I don't know, do you know whether there's...
Yeah, you want to add or go ahead.
I think if we go back to what I was talking about, the revolutionaries borrowing a lot of the institutions of the ancien regime, a lot of the Constitution of 1906 was based on the Belgian model. And the electoral laws were also based on the French system even before the revolution. So after the revolution, all that the Revolutionary Council, who was in charge of drafting the law, ended up doing is tweaking the electoral law to a certain extent and bringing in Islamic elements, you know, sort of the candidate qualifications. So they've inherited these institutions, and I'm assuming that they were comfortable with a lot of the laws, and they just modified some of them. So the French influence really goes back to over 100 years ago, not unique to the Islamic Republic.
In terms of the position of supreme leader, I don't think Ayatollah Khomeini, when he was sitting in Najaf, was reading Rousseau. His inspiration, you know, he wanted someone who would represent the hidden imam, basically, on earth. And those of you here know that this is the Shia cleric who disappeared in the 9th century, I think, 9th, 8th, in what is now Iraq, and he's supposed to return someday as the Mahdi, the Messiah, and bring justice to the world. And Khomeini, with all due immodesty, saw himself as a placeholder for the hidden imam, and as the ultimate arbiter of justice and Islamic purity. So that's where that role comes from.
Okay. The question was talking about the Assembly of Experts, which he pointed out is elected, and he wanted to know what is their effective role, and stress that a little more. And also on vetting, the question was, you talked about vetting, it's not an ideal situation, but in other countries, including ours included, he was saying people are vetted by money, sometimes by PR, sometimes by media relations. It's a different way of having people rise to the top. And I don't know if anyone wants to
do the
comment
Assembly
on
of
that.
Experts, and I'll do the money.
Sure. I'll touch on that a little bit too. I didn't talk about the Assembly of Experts in the report because even though they're directly elected, in the past 30 years, they haven't done anything significant. They're supposed to sort of monitor the conducts of the supreme leader, and they do that by meeting every single year and praising the leader and renewing their bay'ah with the leader. So I try to stay with the institutions that have had more, have demonstrated more power in the past 30 years. Now, in terms of voter qualifications, I'll just draw your attention, or vetting, I'll just draw your attention to the qualifications that exist for the presidential elections. Women cannot vote, cannot be presidential nominees based on the qualifications and the vetting process. Recognized religious minorities, as well as Sunni Muslims even, cannot become nominees because they won't be vetted by the Guardian Council, because the person who's running needs to be an adherent of state religion and really a Shia Muslim. I think I'll pass that on to Barbara if she wants to sort of touch on that.
On the money aspect, it's funny you mentioned that. One of Rafsanjani's sons, Mehdi Hashemi, gave me an interview in 2005, and he was bragging at the time. This was when his father was contemplating running for election again. And he was bragging about the Iranian system and how they have an election almost every year. And I said, well, what about the Guardian Council? He said, yeah, we have a Guardian Council, but we know who they are. He said, you have one too, but you don't know who they are. He said, they're the people with money. So you're quoting Mehdi Hashemi. Obviously money is key, but to get somebody like a Barack Obama, to be able to attract the funding that enabled him to become president of the United States, that's not possible in a system like Iran's right now. The closest I think you could come to it would be the Khatami election, where the government anticipated